I will present our guest now. Todd Zywicki is George Mason University Foundation Professor of Law and the Antonin Scalia Law School at George Mason University. He's a research fellow at the George Mason Law and Economics Center. From 2015 to 2017, he was the executive director of the George Mason Law and Economics Center. From 2020 to 21, he served as the chair of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau Taskforce on Federal Consumer Financial Law. And from 2003 to 2004, he served as the director of the Office of Policy Planning at the Federal Trade Commission. He is also a senior fellow of the F.A. Hayek program for the advanced study of politics, philosophy, and economics at George Mason University, and a former senior fellow of the Cato Institute. In 2021, he was inducted to the American College of Consumer Financial Services Lawyers. Professor Zywicki clerked for Judge Jerry Smith of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit and worked as an associate at Alston and Bird in Atlanta, Georgia, where he practiced bankruptcy and commercial law. He received his doctorate from the University of Virginia, where he was executive editor of the Virginia Tax Review and George Olin Scholar in Law and Economics. Professor Zywicki received a Master of Arts in Economics from Clemson University and an A.B. cum laude with high honors in his major from Dartmouth College. He has taught at Vanderbilt University Law School, Georgetown University Law Center, Boston College Law School, Mississippi College School of Law, and China University of Political Science and Law. Professor Zywicki is the author of more than 130 articles in leading law reviews and peer-reviewed economics journals. He has testified multiple times before Congress on issues of consumer bankruptcy law and consumer credit, and is a frequent commentator on legal issues in the print and broadcast media, including the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, the Washington Post, the Washington Times, Nightline, the NewsHour with Jim Lehrer, Neil Cavuto Show, Fox and Friends, Matt Cornish, Fox News at Night with Shannon Bream, Fox Business, CNN, CNBC, Bloomberg News, BBC, The Diane Ram Show, Dennis Prager Show, Mike Smirkoni Show, Lou Dobbs Show, Mike Gallagher, and the Laura Ingraham Show. That's quite a list. And I have to tell you, I met Todd a month ago during the Law and Economics Center conference in Destin, Florida, during spring break. He gave both the opening and the closing lectures, and what he gave us at the closing was perhaps the scariest lecture I've ever heard. I hope you enjoyed today. Thank you, Todd, for being with us.
Well, thank you, Alex. If I scared you, then I achieved my goal. Because I hope we should all be scared after you hear me today, if you're paying attention. Because I think what's going on here is quite scary. And my topic today is what we've called cancel culture and the regulatory state. And I'm particularly going to focus on the question of banking as we go through. But what we'll see is that the lessons we can draw from banking, I think, are more generally applicable. Banking law and regulation is particularly a clear case of the problem because of the heavily regulated aspect of banking, the way in which it's regulated, but also the importance to people's lives. So I just want to start off by a thought experiment. Say it's the 1960s, and you're Martin Luther King. And you decide that you are going to walk across the Selma Bridge, for example, and risk getting arrested for blocking traffic. Or you're a civil rights protester who is going to risk being arrested for trespass for sitting at a all-white lunch counter. And let's say then you actually do get arrested. And then the next thing that happens is people, you rally support to your cause. You show the injustice of the law. And so people respond. people respond. They make contributions to the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, for example, to support your efforts. Or people try to they try to give you money so that you can be bailed out of prison, right? The court gives you bail for your violations of law, for trespassing or blocking traffic, or whatever the case may be. Now imagine the next thing that happens is that the government says you are violating the law, you are trespassing improperly. So as a lawbreaker, we are going to freeze your bank account. You will no longer be allowed to, you won't be able to spend your money, you won't be able to access your money. That means you won't be allowed to, even though we're going to post bail, even we'll set bail for you, you're not allowed to post bail because you don't have any money. And so you say, okay, well, what will happen then is my organization can post the bail for me, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. They say, no, 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 no. You see, they were helping to facilitate this, so all of their funds are frozen too. And anybody who donates money to the Southern Christian Leadership Conference is also going to have their bank accounts. And anybody who donates money to you directly to help you post bail is going to have their bank accounts frozen, or if they support the efforts that you have to that are in furtherance of breaking the law. Now, what you would see there is constitutional rights in that world are not very robust, right? Your right to protest, your right to free speech, your Eighth Amendment right to bail, reasonable bail if you're arrested. Those rights don't vary very much in that world, right? Well, is that just hypothetical? No. That's basically what happened to the Canadian truckers who a few weeks ago were protesting the Canadian vaccine mandate, as you may recall. They had their bank accounts frozen. One of the leaders of the organization was originally given bail, but was unable to unable to access her own funds in order to post her bail. When people donated money to help her give her bail, or to help all the truckers to support their protest activities, Justin Trudeau's government froze their bank accounts. They froze the bank accounts of people who supported money. Some people who had nothing to do with Canadian truckers, who happened to have the same name as people who were supported the Canadian truckers, also had their bank accounts frozen. And you may recall, yet another thing that happened was the platform to which people donated in order to support the efforts of the Canadian truckers. That platform, basically, the government said, we're seizing the funds. Originally, they were going to seize the funds and just give it to somebody else. But instead, they said you can't distribute the funds because that would be in furtherance of this conspiracy to break the law through these activities like trespassing and the like, right? Really serious stuff that they were doing there. So then it went to a second organization. That organization, I think it was called Give Send Go, the second group. They ended up being subject to the same thing, and they were also told you're not allowed to distribute the money that people have donated to support the activities of these protesters. And so they too announced that they were going to have to return their donations to the people who donated money to support the efforts to challenge the vaccine mandates in Canada. Right now, that is not at all unrealistic as to what could happen and what is actually happening in the United States right now, which is the weaponization of the financial system as a case study in terms of the role of the regulatory state and the nature of the regulatory state to infringe on people's civil rights, constitutional rights, and to interfere with the democratic process. Before I move on to the more general point, a lot of you might be thinking, I know Northwood, I'm very familiar with the school, great school, but a lot of you are probably thinking, well, what's the big idea, Zywicki? It's like, we'll just use Bitcoin, right? We'll use crypto that the government can't get access to. Well, turns out The regulators it's not like they didn't see the Bitcoin effort that people could use to try to get around these regulatory limits. So what did they do in Canada? In Canada, they issued orders, judicial orders were issued to Bitcoin wallets, people who held Bitcoin wallets, and basically, Bitcoin banks where you convert Bitcoin into and cryptocurrency into money. They said if any of these people try to convert cryptocurrency into money, you have to freeze their Bitcoin as well. So several $1 million of Bitcoin, after the initial efforts were shut down, several $1 million of Bitcoin were donated. That too, they were unable to access because in order to buy groceries or post bail or buy a train ticket or a plane ticket, you have to be able to still convert it into dollars. And that had to go through one of the crypto exchanges. And they also told them to freeze people's accounts. So they basically had debanked and taken away access to funds for anybody who the government decided was involved in this. And note, there was no judicial process for these people. There was no due process. It's not like they had been arrested and convicted of a serious crime. It was purely done by an administrative process after it was authorized by the government. So this is a real possibility. And you take it one more step. If you add in the possibility that some people have talked about central bank digital currency as being the next frontier, central bank digital currency would allow the government to control even more the activities that you use, what you use your money for, and the like. And so I hope you are sufficiently alarmed to think about whether this could happen in the United States. And I think the answer is that not only could it, but something like that has already been happening. And I think it requires us to think about, especially those who are interested in the preservation of the free society, how we want to think about these issues going forward. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about that today. I'm going to talk about some of the ideas that are out there that might be feasible for trying to deal with these situations, and in particular the heightened threat that is posed by the regulatory state in terms of providing a particular risk on this, especially for various power asymmetries and imbalances that exist within the federal government. As Professor Tokarov noted in my introduction, I've seen the regulatory state from the inside. I've worked in the federal government. I've worked a lot with the federal government. One of my friends said that I've served as an enzyme in the stomach of Leviathan, having worked at the Federal Trade Commission and other places. And so I've kind of seen this and how this works, especially in financial services. But the lessons here, I think, as we'll talk about, may be generalizable beyond financial services, into areas such as the internet, social media, censorship, employment law, and the like. And let me frame this in a particular way, which is that the way conservatives or libertarians, those who believe in the free society, the way we have traditionally thought about this is through sort of a binary lens, that there are sort of two realms in society. There's the public and there's the private, and that we've been concerned about public power but not concerned about private power because we think private power can be checked. And so what we have done, and I speak of this now from a legal perspective, is we have tended to focus on the way in which we can use law to control the formalities of the use of public power through things like the Administrative Procedure Act, the separation of powers, constitutional limits, and that sort of thing. And we have generally said that we're not going to concern ourselves so much with what might be perceived of as private power, because private power is essentially subject to market constraints and the like. And in the world of the first best, I think that's right, right? In a world in which this distinction between public and private power is clear like that, I think that generally makes sense. But I think the question is, are we still in the world of the first best? So take, for example, in the world of the first best, where anybody could start a bank or anybody could convert cryptocurrency into to cash, there's not really an issue, right? If some people get their bank accounts canceled, then you just start a new bank, right? You find somebody to do it. It's like, going to a restaurant or something, right? If somebody doesn't like you at a restaurant, you go to another restaurant where they're not as rude to you, right? Because that's a pretty unregulated market. But we know there are markets, and banking is a good example, where this public-private distinction is not quite as clear. It's not a binary distinction, but it's more of continuum. So, so that's the first thing, which is it's not always clear nowadays in the world of the regulatory state that can we really think of a bank as being a purely private company in a world in which banks are so heavily regulated? Barriers to entry are so high, and you basically have to get permission from the government in order to start a new bank, where you are subject to the rules and regulations in such a comprehensive sort of way. Is it meaningful to still call banking a private company, or is it something more like a regulated public utility? Especially when essentially what we've established now is that when banks go belly up, we bail them out, right? I did a lot of work on Dodd-Frank. I've been touring the country for the last 10 years since Dodd-Frank was enacted. I've probably spoken to thousands of people about Dodd-Frank. And I'll ask you who are here today the same question that I've asked them. Dodd-Frank was supposed to do one thing. It was supposed to get rid of too big to fail. Right? We're never going to bail out another bank. Is there anybody who thinks that we're never bailing out another bank in America? Is there anybody who thinks we've gotten rid of too big to fail as a result of Dodd-Frank? I don't think so. And of the thousands of people who I've asked that question to, including members of Congress, congressional staffers and the like, and not a single person thinks we've gotten rid of it, right? So what we have now is a system in which banks are protected from failure by the government. They're protected by entry from the government, and they're subject to a comprehensive system of regulation with respect to what they can do. Second thing is it's that banking regulation is not really in any way subject to what we might think of as the traditional rule of law. Banking is subject to this very opaque form of regulation, what John Allison, the former great CEO of BB&T, is called regulation by raised eyebrow, which is sort of, do you really need to do that? Do you really need to have that person as a customer? That sort of thing. And so they have this soft power that is especially done through this process called supervision. And supervision is a process by which they don't issue formal rules. They don't sue you and create formal enforcement. They basically go in and they make suggestions. The suggestions being the mailed fist behind the velvet glove, and through that process they can influence your behavior because they can put you out of business anytime that they want to, if the government wants to. So a good example is just about 2 weeks ago, the head of the CFPB, Director Rohit Chopra, simply announced. We have federal laws that prevent discrimination in credit granting, called the Equal Credit Opportunity Act. He announced that from now on, that's not going to be the only way in which the CFPB is going to start handling discrimination. They're also going to treat anything that they consider to be discrimination under their standards in terms of access to bank accounts, things other than granting credit. They're going to use the power they have under unfair, deceptive, and abusive practices to regulate that. You say, well, how are they going to do that? Well, he just said, we'll do it by supervision. Because if it's supervision, then there's no rulemaking where people get to challenge it. There's no court process by which people get to challenge it, such as an enforcement action. It's simply the government says how that you do it, and it's not quite clear how you challenge it, right? And so what we have is banking is the apotheosis of the regulatory state today, which is a combination of these very with huge public oversight, barriers to entry, right, to protect them from competition, so that you can't just start a new bank and start serving customers, and this opaque sort of black box, regulatory black box way in which we do regulation. And so what we've seen over time is the way in which the government has used it. So think back to the Obama administration. And what we saw during the Obama administration was something called Operation Chokepoint. Now, why was it called Operation Chokepoint? Because what the government had figured out was that the banking system, that they could use the banking system to choke off the air that certain businesses and industries needed to breathe, right? And so what they were particularly interested in was targeting payday lenders. And payday loan companies, of course, are legal in a large number of states, but the Obama administration just simply didn't like payday lending. Now, here's the thing about the way the banking system works is in order to be able to have access to the payment system, which means to be able to cash checks, for example, you need to have a bank account, right? So, AAA payday lending, payday loans or whatever, right? You go in to get a payday loan, you write a post-dated check, you default on the loan, right? When that period comes, then they cash the check. But if you don't have a bank account, you can't offer payday loans because you have no way to cash the check. Does that make sense? And so what did the Obama administration say? The Obama administration says, we think it's a regulatory risk to a bank to offer checking accounts to payday lenders, even though it's a perfectly legal business. What was their basis? Something called reputation risk, and so what they had was basically a hit list. They said, here are some of the industries that we think have bad reputations, and it would look unseemly for your bank to provide services to people in these industries. Now, notably, that included things like payday lenders, that included firearms dealers and ammunition dealers, right, gun shops. That included other things that they just happen not to like online pornography, things like that, right? But the ones they really wanted to get at, and they admitted, was basically all the other ones, online pornography and, work at home scams, that sort of thing. What they really wanted to get at was payday lenders. And so what happened was all of a sudden, payday loan companies found that they were having their bank accounts closed with no explanation and no ability to get a bank account anywhere else, which basically put them out of business with no due process, simply because the supervisor said it would be the government said it would be a reputation risk for you to provide financial services to this industry. And they did the same thing to gun dealers. If you've seen, there was an interview following an article I wrote, I think that was distributed, my Newsweek column. In the Canadian truckers, John Stossel did a video on YouTube that was a follow-up to that, and he interviewed a gun dealer who had a gun company who had her shop closed, put out of business by the fact that she could no longer get a bank account because basically the Obama administration had branded them as a company that had a bad reputation. Now, what's notable about that? You can look as much as you want. You're not going to find, say, abortion clinics on there. You're not going to find environmental groups on there, right? It was a clear ideological sort of attack on certain industries that were said to have bad reputations. Why did they have bad reputations? Basically because the Obama administration said these industries have bad reputations. And what we've seen is that idea of debanking certain industries has spread. So you may recall President Biden's initial nominee for the comptroller of the currency had previously said that she was going to basically used the banking system to put the fossil fuels industry out of business, bankrupt the fossil fuels industry. So what we see now is the regulators, the banking regulators, are leaning on banks to start debanking fossil fuels industry in order to promote their climate change agenda by simply raising the cost of capital, making it more difficult for oil and gas companies to do business, and essentially create policy in a completely non-transparent, non-democratic way. Right? That is how this regulation works. Now, what's happened since then is this virus, this idea of using the financial system to debank people on the basis of, in that case, the industry they serve. Now what we see is that has started to spread to individuals, and they've started ideological targeting under the same idea. So this idea has been kicking around for a while, and there have been rumors that, and a lot of them they confirm, that small people you've never heard of, have lost access to their bank accounts for things like being called a white supremacist, for example, or somebody who was a very outspoken person against Islamic terrorism had her bank account taken away and was unable to get another bank account as a result. Sometimes these things have come to a head. So Michael Flynn, who you may have heard of, very controversial person from the Trump administration, had his credit cards canceled by Citibank. After he complained, they reinstated them. This really came to a head this fall when there was a group in Missouri who was going to host a speech by Donald Trump Jr. And then the payment processing platform for the event, which serves J.P. Morgan Chase, said we're not gonna accept payments for this anymore for this event because we don't support hate speech. And so they ended up having to cancel and reschedule the event. Right now, what happened in that case was Flynn, Donald Trump Jr., they were powerful enough, they had enough of a voice that they were going to make a stink about it. And Flynn got his credit cards given back to him, right? Donald Trump Jr.'s program was able to go forward with a new payments provider. But what about all these other people who wouldn't be able to do that, right? What about all the people who are like the Canadian truckers, people you've never heard of before, who don't have clout in Congress and that sort of thing? And in fact, quite ironically, literally the day after I published my article in Newsweek warning about cancel culture and banking, Mike Lindell, the My Pillow guy, you may have heard, who was very close to Donald Trump, had all of his bank accounts, his bank, it was released that they was going to have his bank accounts canceled for both his personal account, the My Pillow account, and some charities that he did. And there's actually a recording that's quite chilling of the bank officer telling him, we're asking you, we're giving you an opportunity to close your bank accounts before we close them for you. And Lindell's comptroller said, well, what if we don't close our bank account? And the bank officer, vice president, said, well, then we're going to have to close your bank accounts for you, and then we're going to put you on something called the bad boy list, which I'm still trying to figure out what that is, which will basically make it difficult for you to get a bank account with anybody else, which is what happened basically with the payday lenders, right? So what we see now is this combination of corporate wokeness, right, and political correctness, combined with activism, right? The activism we see leaning on corporations and on a lot of other areas, and then you add in this overlay of the regulatory state and these ideas of things like reputation risk, which cannot really be defined except by the subjective assessment of whoever the government official is. And you have the perfect recipe for basically closing people's bank accounts and punishing them for expression of their political idea. And why is this a problem? Because without a bank account, you really can't live. You can't buy groceries. You can't get a credit card. You can't buy a house, right? You basically have to have a bank account in order to live in this country now, because as I said, you have to have a bank account in order to be able to get access to the payment system. My local Harris Teeter, they don't take Bitcoin over there, right? And so basically this is the ultimate Operation Chokepoint, which is to threaten people. If you express ideas that are not approved by the prevailing zeitgeist, then you can suffer consequences that'll be very severe, right? And what the concern here is not just the direct impact of these people economically, but you can see how this can be used as a lever to chill people's participation in the democratic process. And that's what I think is especially concerning about this, is that we live in a system of democratic capitalism. And by democratic capitalism, the idea is people have to be free to participate in the democratic process without it ruining their livelihood and losing their ability to lose their livelihood. They need to be able to express controversial ideas in public and participate in the democratic process without losing their livelihood, and vice versa, right? Which is, I think, this idea of using control over the economic process to basically coerce people's silence is very concerning, right? And so what we see, for example, is the pressure is ratcheting up on individuals when they're going after people like Mike Lindell. It's ratcheting up on using the banking system to go after certain industries like fossil fuels. And what we see then is the use of this very opaque regulatory process in combination with corporate political activity and activists to basically be able to control, be able to control dialogue and debate, discussion in the country. And so and we can see this in other areas as well, right? I mean, obviously, social media is the place where most people think about it. Now, you could take basically the same questions and ask about social media, right? Which is what I think is very concerning about banking. What makes banking in many ways the easy case is this combination of systematic regulatory control through barriers to entry and the oversight of the process, combined with the opaqueness of the regulatory process, right? And legal, right, barriers to entry. Social media, then the question becomes, you start thinking about the same sort of thing. Well, what are the barriers to entry? Know what the barriers to entry look like there. It's not so much regulatory, but what we're starting to see is what? The same sort of thing developing. If you follow what's happened, is the White House, for example, has made very clear that they're leaning on social media companies to censor what they consider to be misinformation about COVID, misinformation about COVID vaccines and that sort of thing, and it basically threaten them with consequences if they don't do what they want them to. Right? Various politicians have threatened antitrust action, penalties against social media companies, and so the idea here is if we wait sort of for this traditional public-private distinction, if we wait for this idea that it's not until the government actually issues a regulation or takes an enforcement action that all of a sudden then this becomes a threat to liberty, then I think we're being naive about all the different tools and levers and the lack of rule of law constraints that we have on the modern regulatory state that we need to be more aware of, and the possibility of the pernicious use to stifle political discussion, debate, and the like. So what do we do about this? I think that's the next question. If you think there is a problem, the question is there a solution? What's the solution? Well, I think obviously the first thing to do is to try to promote more competition. If you take financial services, for example, this is something I've spent a lot of time talking about. As Alex noted in the introduction, I was the chair of a task force for the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. And the centerpiece of that report is we need more competition in financial services. So, for example, 10 years ago or so, Walmart requested a banking charter. And the incumbent banks, especially small banks, blocked Walmart from getting a banking charter basically because they knew Walmart would be able to outcompete them, right? Whether it's fintech, whether it's called industrial loan companies like Walmart would have been, whether it is competitors to the credit reporting system, through new data, whether alternative data, whether it's cryptocurrency, you name it, right? Whether it's more credit union chartering, for example, is another thing that we call for, right? All these different sorts of things. More competition is the initial way of doing this. If you've got sufficient competition, then there's less concern about all of these issues. But is that a panacea? Well, not if they're all subject to the same basic regulatory regime, right? And that's the concern that I have. Is even if we allow more competition, we still run the risk we still run the risk that they'll all be subject to the same regulatory framework that we have in place, and so you'll still have these things like we have with the payday lending industry and the like. Second, they have to be on a sufficient scale where they can sort of serve the customers that they need. So what does that mean then? Well, as I said at the outset, in the world of the first best, this wouldn't be a problem. Free entry and freedom of contract solves the problem. I don't think we are in the world of the first best. So what does this look like in the world of the second best, whether or not, whether it's banking, whether it's social media, whether it's employment law, right, and people being fired for the expression of their political views on their free time on Facebook or something like that? What about then? Well, one of the ideas that was proposed at the end of the Trump administration was by my friend Brian Brooks, who was the acting controller of the currency. And Brooks proposed this idea called the Fair Access to Financial Services rule. And what the rule basically said was, in deciding whether or not to provide financial services to an individual or an industry, you can only take account of their objective economic risk, right? You can't take account of these goofy, soft ideas like reputation risk that are so completely subjective and subject to abuse. So you can't turn off funding you can't discriminate against the fossil fuels industry, for example. But you've got to have the same policies based on economic risk, and the same thing for individuals. Richard Epstein, you may be familiar with, very prominent libertarian law professor, has argued for the same sort of idea with respect to social media platforms and the internet, which is, he says, under the common law, you have a traditional idea for like public utility type regulation, where you have to grant non-discriminatory access. And non-discrimination doesn't just mean race and the like. It could include things such as your political beliefs, right? So that Twitter and Facebook and that sort of thing could not discriminate against people based on their political views, right? So-called common carrier regulation. Now, there's a long history of this. There's nothing radical about this. So, for example, the post office is, I don't know if you know this, but the postal office is technically a private business, the United States Postal Service. But it's not treated like a private business. So, for example, the post office, even though it's a private business, cannot refuse to deliver, copies of Mein Kampf, right? The post office can't refuse to deliver, so-called white supremacist literature based on the fact that the people who run the post office are offended by the content of that material, right? So they basically said, you are subject to common carrier regulation as a private business, which means you are required to deliver all mail regardless of its substantive content, even if you think it's hate mail, right? If it's legal, you're required to deliver it, and that's basically what Epstein has called for with respect to the internet, right? So, in the world of the second best, is it possible to start thinking in terms, in the world of the second best of the regulatory state, are there things that could be done that could expand liberty, that could protect constitutional rights proactively, even with respect to what might otherwise be thought of as private businesses? Now, it's very easy to start thinking through the intended and unintended consequences of all this, right? You could imagine, obviously, the unintended consequences, for example, of making banks bank people who they might not want to, right? One of the arguments that's made, I think, is bogus. This is the argument that says, well, if we have to provide bank accounts to people we don't like, that's going to upset our staff and our employees and our customers and that sort of thing. I think that's just a ridiculous argument, which is to say, nobody boycotts the post office because the post office delivers, white supremacist material, right? Why? Because all they have to say is, we're required by law to do this, right? We're required by law to provide access to everybody. Even if they don't want to say they want to do it, they can say we have to do it. And I think most people are sensible enough to say, well, they don't say, well, we expect you to break the law, right, in order to do it. And so I think, for example, banks would be a heck of a lot better off if they never went down this path of basically canceling individuals, canceling industries, and basically inviting that sort of pressure on them. And I think they'd be better off if they could just say, no, right? We're not allowed to do that. And they would be out of this political briar patch that they're in right now, because what we're seeing now is not just the Obama administration was going after them and the Biden administration is going after them. Now, members of Congress are starting to go after them. On the Republican side, they're talking about legislation that would make them do this. And that could be a lot worse for them than otherwise. So I think that's a silly argument, personally. If they're required to do it, I don't think that people are going to blame them for following the law. I think a more interesting argument is, we get what the idea is, but doesn't that open up the potential for abuse by the left, frankly, because that's who I think we're really concerned about here, because they're the ones who have shown this to be a problem. And I think personally, and I'll close on this point, I think personally, I think that's a little bit naive, which is to say, I don't think Elizabeth Warren is sitting around waiting to have legal authorization to bless her to bully the banks or the social media companies into doing this, right? Which is, think about what I just said. The Obama administration was already doing it. They've already been doing it, even without any legal authorization. What does the legal authorization add that they're not doing already? Right now, they're just using supervision, which, as I said, you basically can't challenge supervision because there's no formal process for challenging supervision. So I think it's one of these things where if you take, for example, most of your college students, most colleges, when they have speech codes, the argument that's been made for a long time is, well, you shouldn't support speech codes because, someday this might be turned against you. And frankly, my impression is when the left hears that, they just laugh because they know it's never going to get turned against them, right? The Palestinian students know that speech codes are always going to be disproportionately used against Israeli students, supporters of Israel, not Palestine. The left always knows that it's going to be used against conservatives and never be used against left-wing groups. As we've seen, for example, if you followed the brouhaha at Georgetown Law School involving my old friend Ilya Shapiro, where he's being basically pilloried, whereas members of the Georgetown faculty from the left have said much, much worse things than anything he said, much less implied, which was clearly a lot less of a problem. So I think in that sense, if that is the concern, that this could provide, access for the left, basically be able to abuse their power, I think that's naive, which is, I think, the modern left, the modern progressive regulatory state has basically been weaponized to the extent that they don't care about the rule of law. And a good example was, if you recall, when the CDC passed its so-called eviction moratorium with respect to COVID, they decided to, even though the Supreme Court said, we're going to allow it to expire, but don't renew it, President Biden went on TV and said, this is probably illegal, but I'm going to do it anyway, right? Or I know this is illegal, but I'm doing it anyway, right? And that's basically what their attitude is become, which is we're going to do it, and we'll just keep doing it. And if you could come up with some way of stopping us legally, we don't need legal authority. We're going to put the burden on you to basically push back against us. So I think that, and basically banks just follow their bidding. So I think, where I'll bring this to a close then is what I'm suggesting is that our traditional way we thought about through sort of protecting freedom, through sort of public-private distinction, through notions such as the rule of law, Chevron doctrine, these sorts of things. I'm not sure that, while those have stood us in very good stead for many, many years, for decades or centuries, I'm not sure that the traditional way we've thought about protecting freedom and what the threats to freedom are and how to effectively protect freedom, that those tools are any match for the modern regulatory state as it is being wielded by modern regulators, and particularly the modern progressive regulatory state. And I think that what we've seen over the past few years, in particular, is it's not just the policymakers, but the bureaucracy itself. I like to joke, I worked in the government. Maybe Donald Trump was crazy, but that doesn't mean there's not a deep state. There is a permanent bureaucracy that has its own ideological agenda now, and they use it to press on these things, and the lines start to get blurry as to where they begin and the political actors end. And so I think it's time to start taking seriously the threats that are posed by this interaction between the monetary regulatory state and the way it intersects with potentially private power, and what that looks like in the world of the second best, acknowledging that any step down that road is fraught with potential unintended consequences. But I think we need to be thinking in a contextual sort of fashion. So those are my remarks, and I know I have time for questions. And so, Alex, should I just scroll through? How do we like to do this? Should I scroll through the questions that have been typed to me, or
it may be best, if you choose your questions. I see 7 of them already posted at different times during your presentation.
Right.
So they address different things. I warned the audience. There's some scary stuff. If they were afraid after the lecture by Michael Tanner last night when he talked about the national debt, well, there is some more that you will bring up today.
That's right. That's right. It's a scary time. So I'll just scroll through these and try to answer them briefly. So the first question was, what justifications did Canada use to stop the truckers to post bail? So this is what's tricky here, right? Which is technically they gave them bail. In the Eighth Amendment, for example, the U.S. Constitution says you have a constitutional right to reasonable bail. But what they did there was they used something called the Emergencies Act. And the Emergencies Act allows the government to freeze bank accounts in an emergency, right? And this is what's so nefarious about this is if you take Operation Chokepoint, for example, what the government did in Operation Chokepoint was they started with something with an idea that isn't crazy, that actually has some sense to it. And basically the idea was that we have on the books first, start with the core idea, right? We start with the idea that we have on our books anti-money laundering and anti-terrorism laws. And so basically the idea is that there are different ways to protect against money laundering, facilitate crime and terrorism. And one way for that would be for the banking system to be alert to suspicious transactions that could be associated with those things and to report them. Right? That makes some sense, right? It might make you a little squeamish to say, well, shouldn't they have some sort of due process or judicial process or whatever? No, they just put the burden on the banks to identify those, right? So that's kind of questionable, right? So what Operation Chokepoint said was, well, that idea is sound, so why don't we take situations in which we think there's potential for fraud against consumers? And so the banking system is facilitating fraud, right? So they invented this idea, for example, that payday lenders were engaged in fraud because a lot of payday loans default, right? Which is just a stupid argument, but that's what the argument they made was, right? So they said they must be engaged in fraud, or they said we think gun dealers may be helping to facilitate gun crime, so we're going to just force you to basically not do business with those guys, right? And so basically the idea was they took a basic idea, just like the Emergencies Act in Canada, right? The Emergencies Act in Canada was designed to basically keep civil order, to prevent situations in which you might want to freeze people's bank accounts for one reason or another. But then they basically took it and applied it to this completely peaceful protest in Canada. And so that's what gets so dangerous here, which is take these ideas that have at their roots some core ideas that are defensible, and then they, in the hands of the regulatory state, they just expand them beyond all reason, right? They just use it as a political weapon against other people. So that was technically the legal justification in the United States. What they're doing, it falls in this gray area as to whether it's legal or not. And it's not until, in my view, until you focus on the larger consequences it has for chilling political speech and people's ability to exercise their First Amendment rights that you start to see the way in which the state can weaponize this to violate freedom more generally, not just with respect to these things. And here's something that's quite scary about this is, according to a poll, 2/3 of Democrats in the United States support what Trudeau did with the truckers in Canada, freezing their bank accounts. Right? You may also be familiar that half of Democrats in the United States supported, in a poll, supported concentration camps for people who are unvaccinated. About a third supported fines and imprisonment for people who were spreading Democrats spreading so-called misinformation about COVID. Right. This authoritarian tendency is there, and we've really seen it come out the last 2 years in the United States. And so when you think about Canada as being a place of freedom and pretty sane people, they've gotten pretty insane, obviously, as well. A lot of people supported what Trudeau was doing there. Why? Because they just didn't like the political message. And so there's a lot of people, when you've got the whip hand, they are willing to use it to stifle dissent, which is exactly what they want to do here. I saw this point about, will the real privatization banks put an end to this kind of perversion of law? I think I answered that one. The answer is yes, right? That's the first line of defense is more competition and the like. Let me see if I can being politically incorrect in a socialist country means torture and slave labor. People still stood up to tyranny. The worst that happens is getting blocked on Facebook, being invited to university, and losing a job. That's a pretty big a thing. The Americans lost their courage and won the revolution and 2 world wars. Losing a job is a big deal. Obviously, losing a bank account, in my view, is an even bigger deal. But there is a spirit question, I think, that is caught in this, which is about the spirit of liberty, and what are people's willingness to fight for liberty as opposed to freedom, as opposed to what I've seen a lot of is people want other people to do it. And I say that as somebody who's been in this condition of circumstance. If you Google me, if you haven't already, you'll see that last summer, summer 2021, I sued my employer, George Mason University, when they imposed a vaccine mandate on all faculty and staff, because I had already had COVID. I had natural immunity, and I had the opinion of my immunologist, my trained immunologist, who told me, based on my antibodies level and the fact that I had COVID, it was unnecessary for me to be vaccinated because natural immunity, especially with my antibodies level, was at least as protective as vaccines, and it would be dangerous for me to do it. And what's very striking to me is I was willing to do that, to bring that lawsuit and risk the wrath of the empire against me. But the number of people who I talked to who basically said, yeah, I'm going to just go along with it because it's too much trouble to fight it. Right. I tried to get other people to join with me. Same circumstance, like, it's just too much trouble, right? Or I'm afraid of what would happen, that sort of thing. I think that's a real concern. People also ask, I'm going to go through these because I know there's some live questions too. In a country where more than 2/3 of the people are anti-woke, when do you expect the market will provide for-profit good alternatives to these guys? That's an interesting question, and I'm going to answer that in two ways, which is, my personal view is it would be good if we didn't divide into red and blue economies, and sort of formally divide into red and blue economies. My concern is that seems to be where we're headed. And partly the problem is I think corporations have put themselves in this situation. And so one of the things I'm trying to do with this is to think about what are there ways of getting out of this, right? Because what the strategies are right now is essentially this division type thing or tit for tat, right? And tit for tat can work. It can also turn into Hatfields and McCoys, right? But think about it. It took us hundreds of years of religious wars before we got religious toleration. And I feel like we're in the middle of a religious war right now with respect to politics and ideology. So, I hope we don't go down that road, but it's starting to look like that's where it might, where this might end up. Friedman. That's a thing. Thank you, Macovim, whoever that is. Thank you for reminding me of that. The Milton Friedman quote about there is no freedom of speech if the government owns all the printing presses, right? If they own the banks, because this is something. If you've read my my Newsweek column, this is exactly where I end up, which is I basically say the same thing, which is we used to talk about under communism. I'm not sure if I give credit to Friedman on it, but under communism, you had the right, you had freedom of speech under the Soviet Constitution, but if you couldn't get paper, if you couldn't get ink, what good did it have to have freedom of speech? And I think that's a lot of what this is. You can start a business, but if you can't get a bank account, what good is it to have to have a business? And I think that's the way to think about this, right? Is to think about this is not as just economic questions, but as these larger questions. And that's what I'm hoping prompt you guys to think about is that the regulatory state becomes this wedge, not just, we've tended to think of it as an economic problem, right? We tend to think of social media as an antitrust problem. And to some extent, it might be an antitrust problem. I think it's a larger problem. So for example, one of the ways we thought about attacking the problem of woke corporations is as a corporate governance issue, which is people say, well, we should allow more shareholder derivative suits. Or hold the CEOs accountable for freelancing, right? And that may be part of it, right? But when you look at the evidence, what we see is that when corporations do these things, it doesn't really seem to impact their share price very much, right? It's not clear that there's a lot of direct harm to the shareholders. Maybe it's the CEOs engaging in agency costs, but think about this possibility. Maybe they're doing what the shareholders want. That's not that's not necessarily a corporate issue. But think of it this way. Who owns stock in this country? Wealthy elites, right? Wealthy elites tend to take one side of the culture wars these days. They tend to take the Disney side, not the Florida side, right? Of culture wars. So is that really a corporate governance problem if the shareholders of Disney essentially approve of what they're doing? Not clear to me that's the right way to specify the problem. Here's what I think the problem. The problem I think is you've got a California corporation owned by a bunch of wealthy elites, right? Very wealthy people who share views and a viewpoint, ideological viewpoint that is different from from what has been expressed through the democratic process, which is what the Florida legislature has done in that case, right? The problem, I think, if there's a problem, is not the political influence on the corporations in that situation, but the corporate influence on the politics, which is wealthy elites using and wealthy, powerful corporate managers using the clout of these corporations, commandeering it in an anti-democratic fashion to try to impose their will on people who live in a completely different state, right? The California corporation basically trying to use their power to control the democratic process of Florida, right? And the shareholders of Disney and the managers of Disney are not a democratic cross section of the voters in the country, right? Those are different questions, right? That is not a corporate governance issue. That is a question of democratic of democracy, of using anti-democratic means for elites to impose their views and override the democratic process. Now, I don't have any good answers to that, but I think that specifying the question in that way is helpful. Let's see, market regulations change, whatever political party is control. That's Connor Cummings asked a very good question here that goes more generally to the economic challenges of the regulatory state and this sort of pendulum that goes back and forth. I won't give a comprehensive answer to that, but I will say one thing that's worth thinking about. And to some extent, this is a question that's going on in kind of inside the big tent of the Federalist Society, sort of within the conservative movement, right? As I said, the left, progressives, the rule of law, that's not something they've cared about for a very long time, right? So it's not really anything they care about, right? They just make hay while the sun shines. But there's been this debate going on for a long time within sort of the conservative legal movement over what is called the Chevron doctrine. And the Chevron doctrine arose, and it was really popularized by Scalia. And it basically says that courts, when there's an ambiguity in a statute, courts will defer to any regulation based on a reasonable interpretation of a statute by the regulatory agency that is authorized to interpret it. So the original case involved the Clean Air Act and the EPA, and basically what happened was under Nixon, the EPA had changed an interpretation of the Clean Air Act to issue a revised regulation on an issue involving what was a point of pollution was actually the issue under the EPA. And one of the environmental activist groups challenged that and said, no, you're not allowed to do that. The statute says you are prohibited. You are required to basically keep the old interpretation of the rule. You're not allowed to adopt the new interpretation of the rule. Does that make sense? And what the Supreme Court said in Chevron was, no, the agency has discretion. Either interpretation of the law is reasonable, and among those two interpretations, the agency has discretion to decide which one it wants to follow. Now, what was interesting about that at the time is why did conservatives jump on that? Because it actually increases agency authority a lot. Well, the reason was, traditional alternative to that was what federal courts had done in the 60s and into the 70s, which is federal courts just made stuff up, right? During the activist era of the Warren Court and into the Berger Court, courts would just rewrite statutes and say that was the law based on what they felt was the purpose. And so Scalia looked at this and said, well, given the choice between judges rewriting the law, which then will require Congress to pass the law, new laws to amend that, or allowing regulatory agencies the authority to interpret the law, we think it's better to put it in the bucket with the regulatory agencies because at least there's some political accountability, right? Now, there's two issues with that, which is number one, which is what they didn't anticipate was that the regulators would expand the regulatory state not only to the full constraints of their of what's reasonable, but really beyond it, right? Which is courts have become so deferential to the regulatory agencies. The regulatory agencies have been so aggressive about pushing this that they've pushed it beyond any reasonable sense of what's going on, and courts have let them do that. And so basically the regulatory state expands to fit the space allotted through their own self-interest in the like. But the second thing is what the question here is that Connor asked, which is what this does, it creates this pendulum effect, where because you defer to the administrative agencies, what happens is every time you get a change of administration, pendulum rolls back and forth. And now we're seeing this even worse, which is, and we're especially seeing this now with the Biden administration, which is the Biden administration is just basically given up. I gave the example of CFPB. They're basically just not doing rulemaking. They're doing everything through these informal mechanisms. The Obama administration did a lot of this, right? Rather than doing notice of comment rulemaking, which would have a process built into it or the law rules changed, they're just issuing things, right? Mandates and executive orders and all this sort of stuff, which is exacerbating this particular dynamic. I'm going to save Anonymous's question on Elon Musk for last because I think that's a very good one. Let's see. Before I could take any more from the queue, are there anybody in the audience who wants to ask any questions? Or should I just keep scrolling? I'll just say we got a few more minutes left then. Wesley Hoyle asked a question I like, which I've become more aware of and very concerned about, which is this social credit system idea. What the saying has become, which I agree with, is what is the difference between reality and conspiracy theory? About 3 months, right? And if you had told me, 6 months or a year ago that we were headed for a social credit system, I would have said you were crazy, right? When President Biden ran for president, he explicitly said he would not support a vaccine mandate. That didn't last very long, right? And so now what we have are a system whereby, in these states that had, or in cities that have vaccine passports, right? People carrying around already the prototype of a social credit system on their phone, which is their vaccine passport, right? And I saw this part coming, right? Which is originally they just issued the little vaccine cards. And I said, what's going to happen is people are smart, they're entrepreneurial, they're going to start forging the cards, right? Because they weren't made for that purpose, to be shown as ID, to be able to get into a bar or a restaurant or a museum in New York City or whatever. And so I said, what's going to happen next is they're going to say, this system is too insecure. So we need a more secure system to be able to keep track of whether or not these are real vaccine passports, right? Real vaccine cards. And then they're going to need to be able to update them for booster shots, right? And then they have to deal with the fact that these cards might get destroyed or lost in the washer or they get laminated. People need new ones. I was like, seems inevitable that this is going to migrate into something like an automatic updated system for vaccine passports, right? You already had. Once that idea is in place, why not? Why not all of a sudden say, you have to have racial sensitivity training. You have to show your ID that says you have undergone racial sensitivity training before you're allowed to attend this college, or sit in my class, or go to this, apply for a job at our company, right? You can see the easy way this can expand, and I think this platform of cancel culture, I think this is a real issue, right? And this is why I talk about this scary data of, and in particular, it seems to be a problem on the left and Democrats particularly. Let's not pretend like it's bipartisan, but the idea of putting people in concentration camps. 29% of Democrats said that kids should be taken away from parents who are unvaccinated, right? 2/3 who support what Trudeau did against truckers in Canada. Do you think that those same people who support that would have any problem with the idea that people who support who were in the truckers protest should be fired, or people who were spotted protesting lockdowns back when we had lockdowns in this country? People are those lockdown protests, that they should be they should be fired, right? They've already been firing people just for showing up for the January 6th rally, even if they weren't involved. Like things have happened to people who weren't even involved in storming the Capitol, right? Simply by being there, they got in trouble, right? People narking out family members, that sort of thing. I think it's a very scary thing, this authoritarian impulse is something that is very strong, and this is a very powerful tool. And like I said, if it gets harnessed to things like crypto, to currency, to central bank digital currency, I think it's a real problem. Let me close with this last point because I'm almost out of time. I will say I am fascinated, absolutely fascinated by this Elon Musk thing, which is to say I had never used Twitter very much till I brought my lawsuit that I mentioned, and I went on Twitter to be able to, put the data up about things that were related to my case and that sort of thing. And I remember when Elon Musk, like 2 weeks ago, tweeted out this very cryptic tweet about, do you think Twitter protects free speech? And everybody said on Twitter, they were like, is Elon Musk thinking about buying Twitter? Because Elon Musk could buy Twitter, right? And he's just a fascinating character, obviously, right? But I think the answer may be those are the kind of things that people should be thinking about. I think, for example, the idea of engaging with the traditional legacy universities may be a pointless effort, right? The big universities aren't interested. Right? They're perfectly happy to turn. They've got so much money. They're happy to turn away these big, conservative donors. Think, well, they'll want my money, so they'll listen to me. They don't care. They don't care, right? And they don't care about whether they appear hypocritical or unequal or whatever, right? If they get sued, sometimes they care, like on Title IX abuses. But otherwise, they don't care. They're bulletproof. I think this idea of starting new institutions, or what Elon Musk sort of is doing is literally taking over Twitter, right? That may be a way of doing this, right? I mean, that is a strategy. There is a lot of money out there that's been wasted on efforts to try to change the elites, right? Whereas what he's suggesting is something like happened in corporate law, where you would just do a hostile takeover of a company rather than trying to persuade the management to do better. And I think that's a very intriguing model. And there is wealth out there. And they've talked about starting new platforms and the like, but maybe what he has there is, rather than starting a new platform, which he also talked about doing, why not just try taking over an existing one? And so I think it's a very, very exciting, a very exciting prospect to watch, especially on something like that, which obviously Elon Musk gets, that this is right at this intersection of liberty and democratic government with economic power. And so those are the areas where I think this is particularly important. And maybe something happens with banking that could be similar. So I hope. So I'll leave on that. I'll leave on that optimistic note after being very pessimistic for an hour and 14 minutes. I'll leave you with an optimistic note, Alex.
Professor Zywicki, thank you so much for being with us today. You certainly gave us a lot to think about.
Well, thank you. It was a real pleasure to see all you guys. Thanks. Have a great rest of the conference.